So I didn't upload a video on Friday, and the reason for that is because I got blindsided by the news that there is now a new NCAA investigation into the University of Michigan surrounding advanced scouting. And I didn't upload a video because I didn't really feel like making a video that didn't address it, and I didn't have enough time to create a video that I would feel comfortable uploading. And I'm going to do two things right here at the beginning of this video. The first is that I am going to address that I am a Michigan fan. However, I have always and will continue to check any sort of conscious bias at the door. I am not going to provide misleading or biased statements, and I will make it explicitly clear when I am stating my opinion and when I am trying to be objective. The second thing that I am going to address is that I'm going to drop the shtick for this video. This channel is called the JSA Studio. JSA stands for just some asshole, because at the end of the day, I am just some asshole on the internet giving you my opinion. I think this video is going to be informative, and I don't believe that there is going to be any sort of biased information in it, and I'm hopeful that I can provide insightful commentary. So if that's what you found in this video, I would very much appreciate it if you would subscribe and like the video, and also share it if you know other fans of college football. We're going to start off the video proper by talking about what we know, and we don't know a whole lot. What we do know currently is that Michigan is under investigation by the NCAA for two separate things: what I am referring to as time and place violations, and also potentially misleading an investigator. Neither of these cases have any publicly available evidence of wrongdoing. The second thing, which has been beaten to death by everybody who's been covering this, is that sign stealing is not illegal, but it is sort of treated like counting cards at a casino, where it's very frowned upon, but it's technically not illegal. And the last thing that we know for certain is that nobody has any idea what's going on or what happened. So now I'm going to zoom back a little bit, and we're going to spend a little bit more time on each of these things. So Michigan being under investigation for two separate different things, technically that's not all that big of a deal, because I don't think one investigation is going to impact the other investigation. But the fact that Michigan is now being investigated for two different things is concerning, and also I believe it to be noteworthy. The reason that I said the new investigation is time and place violations is because that phrase is typically used to allude to a certain type of violation that actually has precedent for what sort of punishment Michigan could be looking at. And the time and place violations usually revolve around recruiting, or a coach doing something and being somewhere that they're technically not allowed to be. And we'll talk about what that punishment could be later on in the video. Now, as far as sign stealing not being illegal, I think I pretty much hit the nail on the head. You're going to piss off a lot of people if you're actively stealing signs, but if you're good, you're going to piss off a lot of people anyway just by being good. Like, we have very strong evidence that Clemson, when they were winning national titles, knew the other team's signs. It's also been fairly well reported that Mac Brown, when he was at Texas, was also pretty good at this sort of thing. And we also have very strong and compelling evidence that Urban Meyer knew Don Brown's defensive signals during his last 2 years at Ohio State. And I am once again going to reiterate that we don't know what's going on. We don't know what they're looking for specifically, and we don't know how much evidence is in favor of the investigation and how much evidence is in favor of Michigan. Now we're going to speculate a little bit. This is what I think they're looking for. And these are some questions that the investigators and the NCAA itself, if they decide that punishment is warranted, which they will, something like 95 to 99% of all investigations end up with a punishment of some kind. So this is what I think they're looking for. And it's sort of a situation where if one is true, then you go to number two. And if number two is true, then you go to number three. And the first question that they're going to be asking is, did Michigan receive video of future opponents where the video angle is from the stands or somewhere in the stadium? Because if they can't even prove that Michigan received that sort of video, then there is no case to go for. But if they did receive that sort of video, then the next question becomes, who gave it to them? Was it a staffer or was it non-Michigan related or employed personnel? And the third question would then be, would using non-Michigan staff affect the punishment in any way? I think it would, and I think it would make it significantly worse. So let's go ahead and say that all three of these things are true, and let's talk about a quote-unquote worst-case scenario. So let's assume, for the purpose of this discussion, that Michigan did indeed send advanced persons to scout, and they did indeed use electronic equipment to steal signs. This will almost certainly result in the vacation of, at a minimum, this football season and last football season. The reason that I say this season and this past season is because the guy who is allegedly spearheading this operation, his name is Connor Stallions, was not officially employed by the University of Michigan until May of 2022, meaning that Michigan's 2022 season and this 2023 season would become the instant sort of easy punishment for the NCAA. To go along with that, multiple coaches on this coaching staff would receive fines and be suspended for probably at least a full season, maybe longer. And Jim Harbaugh, in everything but name, would be banned from coaching in college football ever again. The football program itself would likely lose half, if not all, of their scholarships for the 2025 and 2026 classes, and probably a bowl game ban for those two seasons as well. And the reason I'm saying 2025 to 2026 is because I don't think this investigation is complicated enough to go on longer than 2 years. I think this will likely be settled by the end of the 2024 NCAA season. The NCAA does like to drag out their investigations and everything. It takes them 6 years to deal with Tennessee. It takes them 5 years to deal with Kansas. They're not a particularly efficient organization. But in both of those instances, they were talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of lower-level violations. This is likely, at most, we're talking 30 Level 1 violations. And you may be wondering, what is the difference between a Level 1 and a Level 2 violation? There are also Level 3 violations. I'm going to give you the definition of them according to the NCAA bylaws. A Level 3 violation is considered a breach of conduct. They are violations that are either isolated or limited in nature, or provide no more than a minimal recruiting, competitive, or some other form of advantage, or provide no more than a minimal personal benefit to either a single individual or a small group of people. This can include inadvertent violations that are limited in nature, extra benefit for financial aid or academic eligibility, or recruiting violations, provided that they don't create more than a minimal advantage. A good example of a Level 3 violation would be a tutor that normally charges people for their services, kind of waiving the fee for a football player. That's not a really serious sort of thing, so there it's considered a Level 3 violation. A Level 2 violation is considered a significant breach of conduct. These include violations that provide or are intended to provide more than a minimal but less than a substantial or extensive recruiting, competitive, or some other form of advantage. This can include more than a minimal but less than a substantial or extensive impersonable benefit, aka benefits to a single person. This could involve conduct that may compromise the integrity of collegiate sports. This can include a failure to monitor, systematic violations that could reveal a lack of institutional control, multiple recruiting, financial age, or eligibility violations, violations of head coach responsibility rules, impersonable contact with a student, athlete, or prospect, and collective level 3 violations. So basically, a whole bunch of level 3 violations altogether can result in a level 2 violation. A good example of a level 2 violation is that there were several schools that got caught scheduling improper face-to-face meetings with recruits during COVID. A level 1 violation is considered a severe breach of conduct. These include violations that seriously undermine or threaten the integrity of collegiate sports, provide or are intended to provide a substantial or extensive recruiting, competitive, or some other form of advantage, or are a substantial or extensive personal benefit to an individual or a small group of people. These can include a lack of institutional control, academic misconduct, failure to cooperate with an NCAA investigation, unethical conduct, violation of the head coach responsibility and rules, payment to recruits, booster involvements in recruiting with member knowledge, intentional violations, or a collective of level 2 and or level 3 violations. So effectively, for the other investigation that Michigan is undergoing, they're accusing Jim Harbaugh of a level 1 violation because he is not cooperating with the NCAA, or at least they have claimed that he was not cooperative with their investigation. In the event that Michigan did send advanced scouts and they did use technology to steal signs, this would almost certainly be a series of level 1 violations that would result in extensive punishment. If Michigan did not use electronic equipment to record or video the signals of future opponents, I think that could get knocked down to a level 2 violation, because that would be more what we would consider a time and place violation. Basically, you sent someone where they shouldn't be, and that is not as severe as a level 1 violation. Or at least I don't think that would rise to the standards being set through the vocabulary and syntax of the rules that outline a level 1 violation. So a lot of the potential punishments that Michigan could receive for doing this are going to come down to whether or not some form of technology was used to gather this information about stealing signs. And depending upon how extensive that is, I could legitimately, and I don't say stuff like this lightly, even though it is just my opinion, I could legitimately see the death penalty on the table for the Michigan football program. Like, if they find hard evidence that they were filming hand signals or sign signals of future opponents, and that they've been doing this for at least the past 2 years, and they find evidence that Jim Harbaugh and pretty much all of the coaches knew about this and decided to not do anything about it because they liked the advantages that it gave them, then a death penalty is a maybe even just punishment. But that's just me, and what do I know? I'm just some asshole, okay? That's just my opinion. Now, I want to make this very clear. A lot of that speculation towards the end of the last segment was just speculation. They are unsubstantiated claims. I was just talking about it to illustrate a potential worst-case scenario, because later on in the video, I'm going to talk about what I think is a more realistic or likely scenario, in my opinion. But before we do that, I would like to talk about some of the unsubstantiated claims that are floating around and some of the rumors that may or may not be true. And what I would like to start off with is actually from the Josh Pate show. For those unaware, Josh Pate is a football commentator. He works for On3, which is a website that mainly does high school recruiting and rankings and stuff like that, kind of like 247, but in recent years they've sort of branched out and gotten some personalities that run daily radio shows almost, but they post them on YouTube. and Josh Pate is one of them. He's very good at his job, and he's one of the best and most rational voices talking about college football right now. And he used this anecdote when this news broke, and that was that the NCAA was giving him some small town sheriff vibes. And what he meant by that is that if you grow up in a small town, he used an example of growing up in a small southern town where there's a sheriff who has been in power for 30 or 40 years and has kind of accumulated far more power than any small town sheriff ought to have. And what he said was that basically if you were to go to a foreclosure auction and you outbid the sheriff for a property that he wants, and the sheriff kind of tugs on his belt and slides his sunglasses down his nose and just says, "So that's how it's going to be." And what "so that's how it's going to be" means is you got a target on your back now, and I'm going to come after you and get you for something. And that's kind of the vibes that this gives off with Michigan. It's no secret that Jim Harbaugh has had a target on his back pretty much since he came back from college football, because really when he came back, I think it was his first offseason of recruiting, he started doing these things called satellite camps, which the legality of was a gray area. Now, ultimately, satellite camps happen all the time now because the NCAA decided that it was fine. But at the time, a lot of SEC schools got very mad at Jim Harbaugh for doing these satellite camps because they were happening in the South. And they bitched to the NCAA, and the NCAA says, okay, until we can deal with it, you can't do it. And then they created rules and regulations about it and how you could do it, et cetera, and now they happen 50 times a day in every big city. After the whole satellite camp thing, Jim Harbaugh went out and said there's no reason why collegiate players shouldn't be able to make money off of their name, image, and likeness. And then after that, he came out and said that he released a whole public letter to the whole world, basically shitting on the NCAA for not implementing the one-time transfer rule that we have now. And most recently, during what I think was Big Ten Media Days, I could be wrong, but it was definitely before the season, Jim Harbaugh came out and said, it's kind of ridiculous that the players aren't getting a percentage of the revenue from the TV contracts. And boy, oh boy, the NCAA did not like that, because that's taking money out of their pockets. They get a percentage of all of the TV deals for college football. And I don't particularly think it was a coincidence that very shortly after Jim Harbaugh made that declaration that the NCAA backed out of a supposed deal that they had with the University of Michigan for Jim Harbaugh to get suspended for 4 games for his alleged level 1 violation. And the only reason I'm saying it's an alleged violation is because technically the investigation is still ongoing, as they haven't released a punishment for him. And I think there's a strong possibility that kind of what happened was Michigan thought 2 or 3 games would be a justifiable suspension. The NCAA probably wanted 6. They met in the middle on 4. Jim Harbaugh talks trash. NCAA says, nope, fuck that. We're just going to go ahead and make a ruling, and he will probably be suspended for 6 games. I think they will likely accept the 3-game suspension this year as part of that, meaning Jim Harbaugh, in my opinion, is likely to miss the first 3 games of next year as well. Went on a little bit of a tangent there, so let's go ahead and get back to the rumors/opinions part of this video. And there was this guy on Reddit who, about 12 hours before, I believe it was The Athletic that had the first article that revealed to the world what was happening. It was either The Athletic or Yahoo Sports. I don't remember. Either way, about 12 hours before that first article dropped, there was a guy on Reddit that posted on Reddit that Michigan was going to be investigated by the NCAA for sign stealing. Afterwards, about 2 days after that, the same Reddit username then came out and said that the NCAA didn't particularly want to investigate Michigan for this, as they found the claims to be unsubstantiated. But then it got leaked that several Big Ten teams had complained about it, so they sort of launched the investigation to save face. And the only reason I'm talking about this is because the guy did technically break the news way before anybody else. But I don't think that's the case at all. They can't just launch an investigation in like 3 days. It takes time for that shit to get rolling. And also, basically, I don't think that that is true, because it's the exact opposite of what I think is pretty clear, which is that the NCAA has a target on Jim Harbaugh's back, and they were just basically looking for absolutely anything that they could hit this guy on. So if several Big Ten teams complained about them stealing signs, I think they would have just launched the investigation to be like, fuck Jim Harbaugh. So I don't particularly put a whole lot of credence into that, but it was something that I did see and was somewhat able to substantiate. The last thing I want to talk about is the contextual evidence. And what I mean by contextual is all of the stuff that I can look at and potentially glean information from. So not hard evidence that I can actually draw conclusions from. It's more contextual stuff surrounding the evidence, where you can sort of pull a narrative from it if you look into it enough. In terms of Michigan actually playing football, I don't think there's a good case to be made that they were stealing signs and had prior knowledge beforehand. Because if that were the case, I think Michigan would be a dominant first half defense, and then the team would come out with new signals in the second half after halftime and be a little bit better then. But that isn't the case. The past 2 years, Michigan has been a second half defense, which could imply that they go into the halftime meetings and come together and say, these are the signals that are being used, so we're going to know what's coming now, so we're going to dominate in the second half, and they do it then. In other words, they actually need to see the signals that are being used and then use their prior research to establish a pattern and figure out what symbols or signs mean what. Additionally, I think if Michigan was guilty and they knew it, the important part of that being, and they knew it, then I think they straight up would have fired Connor Stalions, not suspended him with pay. That seems more like a situation where they're like, we kind of don't know what's going on, but we don't think you're doing what is being alleged, so we're going to basically just send you on vacation for a while. And if it ends up being that you were doing something that we didn't have knowledge of, then fine, you can be fired. And if not, then we can bring you back and you can continue the role that you have been very effective at doing. So let's talk about what I think a realistic outcome could be. And once again, this is just my opinion. But before we can talk about an outcome, we should probably talk about what I think likely happened. The fact of the reality is that if the NCAA launches an investigation, it ends up with violations being found. They don't typically waste their time investigating shit that isn't substantiated or doesn't already have a significant amount of proof or a high probability of being true. Like 95 to 99% of all NCAA launched investigations end up with violations being issued. So I think it's very likely Michigan is going to get more violations, and I do think they will be significant. I think they're probably looking at multiple level 2 violations that ultimately come together and create a singular or perhaps 2 level 1 violations. I think it would then be very likely that Michigan would probably have their scholarships cut in half for 2 years and probably a singular bowl game ban in what I think would probably most likely be the 2025 football season. There is also a significant possibility that Jim Harbaugh fucks off after this season. I think that is a real chance that Jim Harbaugh either goes to the NFL or kind of steps down in pseudo disgrace to lessen the punishments on the program. And then he kind of just chills at home for a year or two and then takes a head coaching job in the NFL. And after 5 years, nobody remembers that Jim Harbaugh was embroiled in controversy when he left, kind of just like how Jim Tressel and Urban Meyer and Pete Carroll are all fondly remembered by their fan bases despite them being embroiled in controversy when they left. Now, I've held on to the belief for a significant period of time, basically since Michigan beat Ohio State and made the playoffs in 2021, that when Jim Harbaugh retired from the University of Michigan, it was going to be when he finds an offensive coordinator that he thinks can be really good. Then he's just going to replace the athletic director whenever the hell he retires or gets fired, and then he becomes the AD, he being Jim Harbaugh. He becomes the AD just like Bo became the AD when he stepped down from being the head football coach for the University of Michigan. And I can pretty confidently say that that's off the table now. So I think if he leaves, it's going to be for the NFL. And if he leaves for the NFL, I think it's also probably going to be the Chicago Bears, because I think they're very likely to end up with 2 top 5 picks, as well as having a good amount of talent on the roster and the ability for Jim Harbaugh to pick his quarterback with the first overall pick, whether it's through them or Carolina. So I think that will be a tempting enough offer for Jim Harbaugh to take. I think the Chicago Bears ownership group would also very likely jump at the opportunity to hire Jim Harbaugh, and I think he would leave Michigan as they are facing the penalties of perhaps a overzealous or small town sheriff sort of NCAA. And if he does leave, I do think that that would lessen the punishments that Michigan would receive. And I think the range of punishments is basically from where I'm saying this is the realistic outcome, where Michigan loses scholarships for a few seasons and then they maybe a 1-year bowl game ban. However, if Jim Harbaugh steps away from the University of Michigan, I think the bowl game ban would probably be lifted, because the NCAA has come out and stated that they don't particularly want to punish players for staff mistakes that previous institutions made. So if Jim Harbaugh does fuck off to the NFL, I think you can safely take the bowl game ban off the table, unless the violations are way more severe than they appear to be. So to me, and again, this is just my opinion, I think the range is probably the loss of some scholarships and some fines as sort of the low-end best case scenario, and that would probably just be a whole bunch of level 2 violations that they didn't elevate to a level 1 violation. And the high end of that is what I outlined in the worst case scenario section of this video, where you're talking about potentially even the death penalty. But what does all of this mean? Well, for this year, it doesn't mean shit. But for the future of the program, I mean, Michigan is already struggling to recruit at a high level, and having all of this hang over their head and the loss of scholarships, I think they'll struggle worse than we've seen. Like, you'd have to probably go all the way back to Rich Rod to see where the University of Michigan is going to be recruiting at. Like, I think they would be recruiting at a low-end Power 5 level, because they wouldn't have the scholarships, and since they don't have the scholarships, players are not going to go there, even though they could probably make enough money to pay for tuition and then some through their NIL program. I don't think they're going to want to do that. I think Michigan would go off the table for basically every single top 300 prospect. Maybe you can get one guy who's in state, who's always wanted to play for Michigan. It's been his dream. But I think for any out-of-state prospect, you can pretty much write them off as not being involved with the University of Michigan. And because of that dramatic step back that Michigan is going to take in the recruiting, they're also likely going to take a step back from the national spotlight in terms of winning. And that is going to have an extraordinary amount of detrimental impact onto the future of the program. Like, I think you're talking about probably 10 years to get to a point where you could be the level of program that Michigan is at right now. But that is all just speculation. It is just my opinion. But as a Michigan fan, I am now speaking as a Michigan fan, I am deeply concerned about this investigation. I do think it is unlikely that we will see any sort of major sort of punishment for this, but even the small stuff, like if we lose scholarships for 2 years, that is going to significantly impact the University of Michigan's ability to recruit, and we're already not recruiting great. So I am very concerned about that. But at the end of the day, what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. If you stuck around this long, that probably means you enjoyed the video. If that's the case, why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the like as well. I would really appreciate it if you did so. I try to post videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday surrounding college football. Wednesdays are usually film breakdowns, so if you enjoy that, you can click on the video on the screen right now. It's Michigan versus Georgia in a hypothetical matchup. And that's all that I have. I'll see you next time.